Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm back with a new video in my series, Units of Total War, Rise of Mordor, with the faction being looked at today being the Haradrim, a faction newly added to the mod in its most recent major update. If you're new to the channel, in this series I look at a faction in the mod Rise of Mordor for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description, going over the history of the faction within the books and films of Tolkien's universe, before looking at the real-life civilizations that inspired them. After that, I look at the units of the faction, discussing their battlefield role, as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic the units are. Now that you understand what topics this video will cover, let's look at the history of the Haradrim. Originating from the first group of humans to wake upon being created, the Haradrim's ancestors were those who refused to migrate to the west, like those who would become the ancestors of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Staying out of the conflicts between the original Dark Lord Morgoth and the Elves and Valar, these ancient people retained their independence. However, their societal advancement lagged far behind the Elves and the other men of Middle-earth, something that would have severe consequences for their descendants, who migrated from the far east to the southern regions of Middle-earth, vast deserts and jungle that would come to be known as Harad. While the people of Harad, the Haradrim, had avoided being drawn into the wars of the First Age, in the Second Age they weren't so lucky, essentially becoming proxies during the struggles for ascendancy between the Kingdom of Numenor and the Second Dark Lord Sauron. Numenor, a seafaring kingdom situated on an island to the west of Middle-earth, began sending explorers to the continent, including the coastal regions of Harad, where the Numenorians used their advanced technology to benefit the lives of the Haradrim, advancing their societies technologically. Beginning to settle the southern coasts with at first villages, then towns, and then finally great cities like the massive port of Umbar, the Numenorians had a good relationship with the Haradrim until after a certain point the Numenorians began to set themselves up as lords and rulers of Middle-earth, demanding tribute from its peoples such as the Haradrim and their neighbours, transitioning essentially into an empire. Enslaving and killing large numbers of Haradrim, the Numenorians gave Sauron an opportunity to begin recruiting the Haradrim to his cause, although due to the overwhelming power of Numenor, as well as the first two wizards sent to Middle-earth, Sauron's ambitions were foiled, with many among the Haradrim refusing to serve Sauron, even if he was the enemy of their enemy, refusing one master for another. After being captured by the Numenorians, Sauron corrupted them, going from a prisoner to a chief advisor, suggesting that the Numenorians be even more brutal towards the Haradrim, using them as human sacrifices, further fueling the hatred for Numenor among the Haradrim. Eventually, Sauron's deceptions would pay off when he tricked the Numenorians into attempting to invade the Undying Lands, leading to the sinking of Numenor and the destruction of Sauron's most powerful enemies, freeing up Harad for Sauron to control. By this point in the Second Age, many of the Numenorian colonists living in Harad had sworn allegiance to Sauron, becoming known as the Black Numenorians and being leaders among the people of Harad, further corrupting them into serving Sauron. At this point, the Haradrim became enemies to Gondor, one of the two successor kingdoms of Numenor, both due to the great evils the Haradrim had suffered at the hands of the Numenorians, and also due to the influence of the Black Numenorians, who hated their kin who had refused to submit to Sauron, and instead fought for the independence of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Fighting in the War of the Last Alliance, the Haradrim were a major part of Sauron's forces. However, with Sauron's fall, they were freed from his control for a time, although his millennia of corruption meant many still harboured evil and darkness against the men of the West. That said, some Haradrim renounced loyalty to Sauron and instead served Gondor, leading to varied complex relations between the southern kingdom of Man and its neighbours to the south during the Third Age. As the Third Age began, the Black Numenorians still controlled many southern cities such as the great port of Umbar. However, over time they began to go extinct, marrying with the local Haradrim. Intent on expanding its borders, Gondor would invade Harad, intent on subjugating Umbar and preventing the remaining servants of Sauron from retaining control of one of the best harbours in Middle-earth, from which attacks could be launched against Gondor. Against the power of Gondor, victory was unattainable, and Umbar surrendered, leading to Umbar and the Haradrim swearing loyalty to Gondor. For centuries, peace reigned between Gondor and Harad until the Gondorian civil war, known as the Kinstrife, in which the forces of Castamir the Usurper and his sons, primarily the navy of Gondor, fled to Umbar and conquered it, founding the Kingdom of the Corsairs of Umbar and being staunch enemies of Gondor, believing themselves to be the true heirs to the kingdom. With peace shattered and the largest city in Harad now independent of Gondor, conflict in the future was inevitable, especially given how much of Gondor's strength was lost fighting in the Civil War. The Haradrim would rebel against Gondor, often fighting alongside the Corsairs of Umbar as well as other enemies of Gondor such as the Aeserlings. For centuries, war was a constant in the south, with Gondor recapturing parts of Harad just to subsequently lose them, the cycle never ending, but Gondor being bled dry of strength nonetheless. Swearing loyalty to the returned Sauron, the Haradrim and the Corsairs would be a constant threat to Gondor and its new ally Rohan, all the way until the War of the Ring. During the War of the Ring, the Haradrim would be a large part of Sauron's armies, capturing Osgiliath as well as fighting in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the cavalry of Harad being destroyed by the Rohirrim, and the Mumakil of the Haradrim causing great casualties to the men of the west. While the Battle of the Pelennor raged, the Corsairs attacked Gondor's southern fiefs as a way of preventing reinforcements from being sent to Minas Tirith. With the arrival of the three hunters led by Aragorn and the army of the dead, the forces of the Corsairs were vanquished, and Aragorn was able to lead those reinforcements to Minas Tirith, helping to achieve a victory for the Free Peoples. While the Haradrim were killed to the last man at the Pelennor, many would fight at the Battle of the Black Gate, and while they held the numeric advantage over the men of the west, once Sauron was vanquished after the One Ring was destroyed, they were abandoned by the Orcs who fled for the hills, although the Haradrim were the last to surrender, fighting bravely to the end. With the War of the Ring over and the founding of the reunited kingdom under the rule of Aragorn, Umbar would be subdued and peace made with the men of Harad, although armies were required to pacify some of the Haradrim who still wished to fight. With the history of the Haradrim in universe covered, we'll turn to their depictions in the films and the books. The Haradrim are antagonists in the Lord of the Rings films and books, being devout servants of Sauron, with the different peoples of Harad being portrayed at different points in the films, such as the Corsairs, even if only briefly, the Black Númenóreans being represented by the mouth of Sauron, and the tribal warriors of Harad who were seen fighting in several battles in the film. The Haradrim are also used in both mediums as a way of showing that soldiers on both sides of a war often have much in common, and are still human, with both the books and the films covering the idea that the reasons for the Haradrim fighting for Sauron are just as valid as the reasons that the people who fight for Gondor and Rohan fight for their kingdoms. In terms of historical cultures that inspired the Haradrim, the bulk of the people of Harad most clearly draw inspiration from warriors from the Middle East, such as the troops of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the various tribal warriors and nomads of the Middle East from antiquity and the Middle Ages. For the other tribes of Harad, they're inspired by sub-Saharan African tribal warriors and kingdoms, such as the Zulus and the Ashanti, while the troops from Umbar are inspired by pirates from the Golden Age of piracy, as well as late medieval European troops, perhaps more so troops from the Italian city-states of the time, such as Florence and Venice, which just like Umbar was a great port city. With the Haradrim as a faction covered, we'll turn to their battlefield units, beginning with one of their potential general units, the Serpent Guards. This heavy shock cavalry unit is very well armoured, or at least the riders are, being the personal bodyguards of Harad's warlords. Looking at the riders, they have conical skull-cap helmets of either bronze or steel, many of them being multifaceted rather than round, some of them having flanges and ridges. These helmets are very reminiscent of those used by Arab heavy cavalry during the Middle Ages, as well as further afield Indo-Persian cavalry helmets, which were inspired by the Arabs. Other helmets they resemble are the acorn-shaped helmets used by heavy Ottoman cavalry, such as the Sipahi, as well as helmets used by European heavy cavalry and infantry, such as knights and men-at-arms, due to the fabric wrap around the brow of the helmet, which is often seen in medieval depictions of warriors. The wraps, also often used by warriors from the Middle East and in India, are useful as a way of providing extra protection from slashing blows, so it's a nice accurate detail to see. In conjunction with their helmets, some of the troops have robes to protect their heads from the heat of the desert sun, while others have aventails, both being accurate and making sense, some warriors preferring extra protection while others prefer comfort. For facial protection, they all have a wide range of face masks and faceplates. Some of the face masks look very much like those worn by Roman cavalry, while others look like the face masks used by Cumans and other steppe peoples, all being good designs to draw from given they were used by horsemen. Some have masks which look like the one worn by the protagonist in the film Gladiator, a mask that was never used in real life by gladiators and is instead a film creation, so it's not that historically accurate, but it is nice to see a nod to other films in the mod. Some of the warriors in the unit lack a mask and instead have massive nasal guards with plates attached to protect the face, something used by Ottoman cavalry in history. Turning to their body armor, they all have a long tunic made of felt or silk, over which they wear either a lamellar cuirass with attached folds to protect the legs, or a scale shirt, some having bronze armor while others have steel, while some of the cuirasses have scale armor attached. For decoration, some of the cuirasses have a silver snake emblem, the snake being one of the symbols of Harad and the personal banner of one of their war chiefs, the Black Serpent himself being killed by Theoden in the books. Protecting their shoulders they have either pauldrons or massive plate gorgets, which, while providing another layer of armor to defend the body, doesn't have a real-life counterpart as far as I know. Some of the horsemen have bronze greaves, while others lack them entirely, instead wearing long leather riding boots. Protecting their forearms they have bronze and steel vambraces, which look quite historical, with the handguard portion being spiked, allowing for devastating punches when pressed together with the enemy in melee. Attached to their backs are wicker structures bearing the banners of Harad, some of the structures being made of bone and metal, looking much like the wings on winged hussars from Poland, designed to make a noise and make the warriors look more intimidating while showing off the banners of who they follow. For weapons, the Serpent Guards use winged spears as lancers, the spears having slight extensions to the side to prevent the spear from going too deep into enemies. Once engaged in the thick of melee, they swap out their spears for swords, wielding a variety of blades. Some of the blades look like ancient Egyptian khopeshes, while others look like Persian shamshirs, others sharing the appearance of the saif, the Arabian sword with its straight blade, while some are forward curved like the Dacian falx, however with sawtooth patterns, making for a very cool collection of weapons all clearly inspired by historical swords. For crossguards, they have a mix of snakes, moons, and no guards at all of these too being real designs. Unlike some of the heavy shock cavalry used by other factions, these guys lack shields, which for once is a bit off historically, given that while they are well armoured, in history troops with this level of armour still utilised shields, with shields only really being abandoned by heavy cavalry to a large degree, once plate harnesses became much more readily available. For shock cavalry, their horses are fairly unarmoured, just having limited amounts of wicker armour protecting their heads and bodies. Turning to their officer, who is also their standard bearer, the unit officer is himself the Black Serpent, who in the books wields his own banner, so it's a nice bit of attention to detail for the modders to make him the standard bearer. For armour, he wears what I'd assume is a gilded mail shirt, if it's not bronze, which fully protects his arms, over which he has a plate breastplate engraved with snakes, something none of his men have and which shows off his status. His legs are protected with a heavy fabric skirt and bronze greaves, while his forearms are protected by plate vambraces. Slung over his back, he wears a leopard skin, something that was seen used historically not just by sub-Saharan tribesmen, but also by wealthy Roman equestrians, as well as the winged hussars of Poland, the skin being a sign of immense wealth given the difficulty in acquiring and importing a leopard skin. Like the rest of the unit, he lacks a shield, instead carrying his black and red banner, while his sword is based off of a shamshir. Overall, a very cool looking officer who's quite distinct from his men and practically equipped. Looking at the unit's role, they're the heaviest cavalry the Haradrim have access to, providing the faction with hitting power. However, that said, compared to heavy cavalry fielded by other factions, they're definitely on the lower side when it comes to survivability, given that their well-armoured riders are let down by their poorly armoured horses, meaning the horses are easy targets, being even more vulnerable than most cavalry to spears and pikes, while archers have an easy time shooting them due to their lack of horse armour and shields. My advice when using this unit is to use it just like any other shock cavalry unit, keeping in mind that while it does very well attacking in melee as well as on the charge, when stuck in melee, the unit can quickly be overwhelmed by attacking enemies. Because these horsemen are the most elite cavalry the Haradrim have access to, they can only be used in limited numbers, meaning that the core of your shock cavalry will be lesser horsemen. As a general unit, while they don't have quite as much staying power as other shock cavalry generals, they are still very useful as shock cavalry, and can be used to punch holes in enemy lines or to cause routes via charges to the enemy rear. Against enemy cavalry they can hold their own, although more elite cavalry can dominate them. I consider them arguably the best general available to the Haradrim, as combined with their respectable damage output, they can avoid enemies due to being mounted, meaning enemy archers become that much less effective in sniping them or being caught and pinned down by enemy infantry. Overall, a unit that gives the Harad roster a lot of muscle, and one which I recommend using as the spearhead of your armies. Moving on from the Serpent Guards, we come to the first of Harad's melee infantry, the Mahud Clubmen. These are tribal warriors from the far south of Harad, the jungles of Far Harad, and visually are inspired by warriors such as the Zulus and the Maori of New Zealand, who actually portrayed them in the films. These men entirely lack body armor and clothing, except for boots, loincloths, and leopard skin cloaks, unlike the Zulu, who did away with shoes as a way of making their warriors' feet harder and capable of marching longer. The rest of their outfit is accurate. The body paint that these warriors are covered in has many different patterns, some having more black paint while others tend to be more red or yellowish white. This body paint most reminds me of Aboriginal tribesmen from Australia, as well as the Maori, African tribal warriors, and Native American tribes. For weapons, the warriors all use a wooden club with a rounded end, looking a lot like the Kanak clubs of the Kanak tribes of Canada, and the knobkerry, a traditional club used by tribesmen in southern and eastern Africa, such as the Zulu, further establishing the connection with the unit. For shields, they look to be made of cowhide and look most like the Zulu Umbumbaluzo shields, which were smaller and sturdier than the largest Zulu shields, being useful and effective in tribal warfare, the main kind of conflict the Mahud clubmen would see in their natural environment. Their officer wields the same club and shield, however, he is more armoured, having a cloth shirt with a band of scale armour around his waist for protection. His face paint is also far more intimidating, being completely black with the pattern of a white skull over it, making for quite a visage. As a unit, these guys are pretty cool, being a good representation of what tribal warriors with a lower level of technology would use when fighting low-intensity conflicts such as sporadic tribal clashes. In battle against guys wearing plate armor head to toe, who were part of a greater war machine, they are at a disadvantage. The unit does better than expected in battle given that clubs are effective weapons in melee, even against armored enemies due to concussion. However, their lack of armor means that they also take casualties quite quickly. Their shields do, however, offer them some protection from arrows, so they do have that going for them. As a unit, the Mahud clubmen will never be the core of a Haradrim army, given that even though they are fairly mediocre, they're the tribal forces supplied from a limited region of Harad, much like the Gondorian fief troops, meaning only 3 of this unit can be in an army. They're a pretty cool addition to an army of Harad, however the faction has by far better troops, even if they don't use clubs like these guys, or have their cool appearance. The next infantry unit that the Haradrim have are the Corsair Marines. These guys are the pirates briefly seen in the Return of the King film, attacking Gondor before their fleet is destroyed by the Army of the Dead, led by Aragorn, although I doubt Peter Jackson gets a cameo as one in the mod. In terms of armor, they all lack helmets, which was something pirates almost always lacked, especially in the golden age of piracy, so it makes sense that these guys wouldn't have them too, especially given that they work as sailors. Their outfits are somewhat historic, wearing trousers and shirts along with vests, or garments used by sailors. However, the studded leather pauldrons that they have are a work of fantasy, studded leather not being a type of real armor. Protecting their forearms, they have leather vambraces, and that's about it for armor, pirates and seafarers often being lightly armored, given that falling into water when covered in armor is a death sentence. For shields, they use round shields on the smaller side covered in leather and rimmed with wood, shields that don't look ahistorical to me. For weapons, they use what appear to be cut-down boarding harpoons and large daggers like dirks. While the daggers are nice, the harpoons are a bit over the top, given harpoons weren't used as battlefield melee weapons even when boarding ships. For pirates, I wish they had cutlasses or short swords rather than the harpoons, although they are a unique weapon in the mod. Their officer is equipped identically to his men, the only difference being that he dual wields weapons rather than a weapon and a shield, using a cut-down harpoon in his right hand and a nice flanged axe that wouldn't look out of place being wielded by a warrior in the Middle Ages, being a good depiction of a one-handed axe with a back spike and a sharpened haft for more usefulness in his left hand. Honestly, the axes would have made more sense as a weapon along with the daggers for the unit, rather than the harpoons. As a unit, these guys are slightly more effective in melee than the Mahud clubmen, although their smaller shields means that they're less resistant to ranged attacks from the enemy, with shock troops easily tearing the Corsair Marines apart. Because this unit also hails from a specific region of Harad, Umbar, it means only a limited number can be in an army, meaning its best use is to give low and mid-tier Haradrim armies some extra melee options. A cool unit that shows off the diversity of warriors to be found in Harad, but a unit that nevertheless is outdone by others in the roster of Harad, such as the Haradrim swordsmen. These soldiers, the archetypal swordsmen of Harad, reflect the warriors who are most often seen fighting for Sauron and are the bulk of his forces. For armor, these guys aren't that well equipped, lacking helmets but instead using turbans and veils mostly, although some lack veils to protect the face, useful for both protection from the heat of a desert environment as well as against cuts to the head, the reason why turbans and the like were so popular among warriors fighting in hot conditions. Looking at the rest of their body, they tend to be lightly equipped, wearing flowing shirts and pants which provide them much needed ventilation. Protecting their chests, they have wicker armor decorated with precious metals and stones worn over their shirts, while atop that they have a large wicker gorget for added protection. Wicker armor, such as rattan armor, was actually used historically by cultures with little access to metals, being more durable than expected and providing more protection than just regular clothing, rattan armor being used occasionally by the tribes of New Guinea. Because of that, I have to say that the wicker armor of the Haradrim is historically based. However, the large gorgets over the top of the wicker cuirass doesn't appear to have a historical basis. Nevertheless, wicker armor is inferior to metal armors in terms of protection, so keep that in mind when we discuss this unit's combat prowess. Some of the unit have wicker armor, however instead of a cuirass it's just a large band around the stomach, protecting it but leaving the upper chest with a gap between the band and the large gorgets. Attached to their backs they have the same wooden structures as the serpent guards, although less ornately decorated, with my same points for that unit applying to the Haradrim swordsmen. Finally, they have metal van braces identical to those worn by the serpent guards. For shields, they use large shields made of wicker decorated with serpents, similar to those used by soldiers of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and by soldiers in medieval and ancient Korea. Wicker actually has some defensive properties shields of wood lack, such as not having a wooden grain which can lead to cracking. That said, wicker can be destroyed by heavy steel weapons more easily than wood. Some of these shields are pure wicker, while others have taut leather wrapped over the top as a way of making the shields hardier. For weapons, they have a mix of the same blades as those wielded by the serpent guards, using kopeshers, shamshirs, and sawtooth falxes. The unit officer is equipped identically to his men, except for his helmet, actually wearing one unlike his subordinates. His helmet resembles the skullcaps worn by orcs in the mod, but also by the Vikings, this helmet being made of wicker, a method of helmet construction which I don't believe ever existed. Attached to the back of the helmet are multiple triangular spikes, which I'm guessing are metal and I'm assuming are meant to fulfill the role of an aventail, although I've never seen something look like that in real life, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it has no basis in history. Turning to the unit role, field infantry, being a core part of your army on the open battlefield or when fighting in fortifications, either as a defender or as an attacker. In terms of quality, these guys are better than the previous units we've looked at, although against other line swordsmen they may suffer, such as the Dale swordsmen and the Gondorian sword infantry. Against lesser swords, they do well though, and can hold a line fairly well. While vulnerable to cavalry like all units, they can sustain enemy fire to a degree due to their shields and armor, although because both are lacking, the enemy will eventually begin to kill soldiers in the unit. Shock troops can be quite dangerous, although they do less damage against the Haradrim swordsmen than they do against the previous two melee units, which will get torn apart by shock troops when facing off against them. A really good thing about this unit is that it has no limit on how many can be in an army, meaning they'll be a core of your melee infantry throughout the game. Although melee infantry aren't the speciality of the Haradrim, this unit being more of an enabler for the faction's strongest strategies, rather than a battle winner by itself. Overall, a very cool unit that has a definitive role to fulfill in a Haradrim army. However, the faction roster does have one more swordsman unit that outperforms it, the Umbar Usurpers. This unit represents the land strength of those Gondorians who fled to Umbar, being the real danger in its armed forces compared to the Corsair Marines. As heavily armoured as the Gondorian line infantry, the Umbar Usurpers are the first melee infantry unit that the Haradrim have that actually have helmets as a standard. For helmets, they have a mix of barbutes similar to those of the Gondorians, but not identical, as well as what I can only really describe as a kettle helm with a raised top, being taller than real-life kettle helms or retaining the brim, while others have ornate nasal helms. The men with nasal and kettle helms have feathers attached to the side of their helmets, as a way of showing their Numenorian heritage and of staking a claim to ownership of Gondor and its past, the feathers most likely being from seagulls, similar to the ones engraved into Gondorian helmets. Attached to their helmets they have male aventails, or for those who have barbute-style helmets, they instead have a male standard on their upper chest, attached to which are feathers, the feathers also serving to hammer home the connection between Umbar and Gondor. For the rest of their equipment, they have black pants and shirts over which they have a male skirt protecting their lower legs, atop which they have two large decorated plates serving as folds. Protecting their torso, they have a plate cuirass engraved with symbols of mermaids, while their forearms are protected by layered plate vambraces. They use large shields which seem to be a cross between kite shields and the Roman scutum, resembling the Gondorian heavy infantry shields. The shields have metal rims on top and bottom, which is both historical and ahistorical, given that the Romans did have metal rims on their shields. However, kite shields often lacked them, importance as a port, as well as the Numenorian and Gondorian heritage of being sailors and explorers. For weapons, they use very nice arming swords that wouldn't look out of place in the 14th and 15th centuries. Overall, the historical look I feel this unit is going for is that of the infantry of the Italian city-states during the late Middle Ages, who were famous for being the first user of the barbute, as well as being very well armoured, generally serving as the military power of cities alongside mercenaries. That said, while the unit does draw inspiration from these troops, there are several key differences, although these can be explained as being due to the unit's role of being heavy infantry for Umbar. For starters, while the unit is better armoured than the other Haradrim melee units by far, it has no mail coat underneath its cuirass, as was known to be commonly done by the Italians, nor does the unit have an arming doublet with mail sleeves to protect the arms, as was done by other cultures as a way of saving weight. Instead, the arms being left mostly unprotected, as are the legs, which lack greaves. This relative lack of armour compared to their real-life counterparts can be explained as the Umbar Usurpers making a concession to their role as heavy infantry for a faction which operates equally on land and water, these troops discarding some armour while retaining others, allowing them to serve as heavy marines capable of overpowering other factions' marines while at sea, while also being heavily armoured enough to serve on the front lines on battlefields, much like ancient Greek hoplites who doubled as marines and land infantry, the hoplites funnily enough being the model of civic armies on which the Italian city-states built, the Italians for the most part not needing to worry about naval warfare in the way Umbar does. Another thing to note is that the shields these troops use are somewhat superfluous, given that infantry in real life tended to abandon shields once they were well armoured in plate, although because these guys lack mail to protect other parts of the body, the shields are more useful than they would be for other units which are more heavily armoured. Looking at their officer, he's equipped identically to his men, except he has a mail shirt underneath his plate cuirass, providing him with more protection. As a unit, these guys are the best sword infantry that the Haradrim have, in quality at least. In melee, these guys are a match for the heavy infantry of other factions like Gondor, essentially being an evil mirror of their swordsmen, being great at fighting against lesser militia units in battle. Against shock troops, they do well, although they are at a disadvantage, while against cavalry they can hold their own somewhat. Archers have a tough time inflicting meaningful casualties on the unit due to their heavy armour and shields, making them very useful at absorbing damage on the front line that could otherwise weaken less armoured units. While the unit is very good in battle, it's let down by the fact it's another unit available in limited numbers, meaning they'll never be able to replace the Haradrim swordsmen, and at best can support them in the late game, unless you plan on fielding an army with a very small elite infantry corps. Genuinely a great unit and one of my favourites in the Haradrim roster, but with the Umbar usurpers covered, all of Harad's sword infantry have been looked at, so we'll move on to their shock infantry, starting with the Haradrim glaives. This unit is equipped identically to the Haradrim swordsmen with wicker armour, so I'll skip that and move on to their weapons. Instead of a sword and a shield, they discard the shield for a short glaive with a nice cutting edge, no doubt useful in conflicts between tribes who tend to not be heavily armoured. Their officer is identical to the leader of the Haradrim swordsmen, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit role. As shock troops, these guys are vital at punching holes in enemy lines during open battles and in sieges. While they're definitely on the less effective side of shock troops compared to others in the roster, and in other factions' rosters, they're still quite useful at carving up enemy units when used well. They should never be on the front lines, as that wastes their effectiveness in hitting enemies already engaged, as well as making them vulnerable to shock cavalry and ranged units, who can both tear this unit apart due to their lack of armour and shields, although when on the offensive against stuck cavalry, they can easily rack up kills, while archers stand no chance if swarmed by them. A very useful unit for early to mid-tier army builds for prospective Haradrim generals. However, the faction has better shock troops in the shape of the Serpent Warriors. These men are significantly more armoured than the previous unit, many in the unit having helmeted turbans, similar to those used by the Ottomans, with veils and robes on their head and face for protection from the elements, and as extra padding, some having scale aventails attached to their helmets. Others have turbans which have engraved plates sewn into them to give their heads some measure of protection, although not as effective as a full helmet, while others have multifaceted skull caps. For torso protection, they wear scale or segmented cuirasses, the segmented cuirasses having large pauldrons attached to protect the shoulders and provide structure to the armour, while the soldiers with scale shirts have large gorgets protecting their upper chest, similar to the wicker ones used by the previous units and just as ahistorical. Some men in the unit wear a mix of armour, having plate protect their lower stomach, overlaid over the top of a scale shirt which protects the rest of the chest. Protecting their forearms, they have long metal vambraces which entirely cover their forearms surprisingly. Protecting their legs, they have a mix of scale folds, plate folds, and leather with studs, which are most definitely unhistoric, not existing in real life and being a creation of film studios more than anything else. Instead of a shield, they wield glaives, many of which wouldn't look out of place in an army raised in the Middle East during the Middle Ages. Some of the glaives tend to be more curved, similar to a shamshir, while others have a more squarish, brutal blade, all of which look like they'd inflict horrific injuries to enemies. The unit officer looks both awesome and crappy, wearing the same outfit as his men, including the leather skirt with studs, which is where the crappy comes into his appearance, whereas his Ottoman-style helmet combined with a Roman-style face mask looks amazing and makes for a very intimidating soldier. In one hand he wields a shamshir-style blade, while for a shield he uses one that resembles those of the Zulu, with a leather cover emblazoned with a red serpent. As a unit of shock troops, these guys are more effective than the Haradrim glaives, having better armour and more developed derivatives of the Haradrim glaives' weapons. The unit has the same strengths as the previous unit, just more enhanced, while its weaknesses aren't quite as notable. The unit should definitely be used to replace the Haradrim glaives in high-tier armies, just in general outperforming them and also having no limit on how many can be in an army, although a shock-focused army isn't really the Haradrim forte, as an army comprised mainly of this unit would still be very vulnerable to archers and cavalry. Moving on from the Serpent Warriors, we come to the last shock unit that the Haradrim can field, and a contender for the coolest looking unit in the faction, the Adunakori. These noblemen of Umbar are those who possess the greatest amount of Numenorean blood, and who consider themselves the true heirs to the Gondorian throne. As is befitting their status, they are very heavily armoured, having ornately decorated helmets that resemble a cross between stereotypical Viking helmets with their eye protection and nasal helms, with an aventail of mail that completely surrounds and protects the face and neck, in a style akin to that of the medieval Rus, giving the unit an intimidating look by removing the symbol of their humanity, their face. Attached to the sides of their helmets, they have to reference their heritage as heirs of Numenor and former Gondorians, Gondor's line infantry having wings engraved into their helmets, while their elite units have actual wings of feathers attached to their helmets, this unit cutting a nice balance between the two. For the rest of their body, They're covered in plate from head to toe, not looking much out of place among a lineup of dismounted knights and men-at-arms from the 15th and 16th centuries, apart from their helmets, which are based on older designs. They have breastplates ornately decorated with gilded mermaids or flowers, their arms being totally covered in steel with pauldrons and vambraces, or having fully articulated gauntlets, underneath the plate most likely being a mail shirt for added protection. Protecting their legs, they have a full set of plate armor, such as sabatons, greaves, and cuissers, making them supremely armored, over which they have either mail or fabric skirts, over which they have ornate plates working as folds. To round off the look, they have black cloaks attached to their shoulders. For weapons, they wield large two-handed swords like greatswords. This is nice to see because as warriors in real life became this heavily armored, they discarded their shields and instead adopted larger, more effective weapons, relying on their armor to protect them while they dealt out greater damage. While many warriors adopted polearms such as poleaxes, relying on their ability to bypass armor, many warriors still continued to use swords, wielding ever larger blades which gradually became closer to operating as a polearm rather than as a sword. The unit officer has the same armor as his men, using an arming sword and a shield like the Umbar usurpers, while instead of a cloak he has a leopard skin pelt, showing off his status as an elevated individual. As a unit, these are the most effective shock troops Harad can bring to the battlefield, their great swords excelling at cutting through enemy formations, decimating militia and elite units alike when catching them off guard. While shock cavalry is still a threat, archers are less so as the unit is very well armoured compared to its predecessors, although the lack of a shield means they aren't as impervious as some other units. While the unit is a cut above the other shock troops in the roster, it's limited like all the other Umbar troops, meaning it can't completely replace the Serpent Warriors unless a small elite corps of shock troops to supplement your main army is the strategy you're going for. One thing to note about this unit is that it can serve as a general. While certainly a cool looking general unit, I consider it inferior to the other options, as while it can consolidate and build upon holes in enemy lines, acting as a reserve, and while it is resistant to ranged units to a degree, it's still very vulnerable to cavalry and can be focused down by archers nonetheless, its speed not being great enough to enable it to escape the enemy's range. Overall, a very cool looking unit that has what it takes to turn the tides of battle and which can lead armies for those generals willing to deploy them as such. With the Aduna Corps covered, all of the Haradrim shock troops have been looked at, so we'll move on to their spear line, beginning with the humble desert spears. This unit is the epitome of a tribal levy, bearing no armour at all apart from their flowing clothes, more useful at defending against the heat than any enemy weapon, also lacking frameworks on their back. For weapons, they wield spears, many of which have long points closer to a sword than a spear, reminiscent of a Japanese naginata or of tribal spears from Southeast Asia. Others have spears with a crosspiece to prevent bodies from going down the shaft. While such spears tended to be more for hunting than for battle, given the state of these troops, these spears are first and foremost used for hunting rather than war. Others have multiple crosspieces of bone or wood, which resemble the spears used by Polynesian tribes in battle. They have mid-sized wicker shields covered in symbols of the Black Serpent or the Red Eye of Mordor, showing off their allegiance. These shields and the quality of the troops make them look almost indistinguishable from the various peasant levies conscripted by states in the Middle East, most prominently by the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but also by other states who came to inhabit its lands, such as the Parthians and the Sassanids, who relied on such men to swell their numbers rather than to be effective warriors. Skipping their officer, who's a standard Haradrim swordsman, we'll get into the unit role. For early armies, these will be the bulk of your forces, being overmatched by most enemies except for the weakest militias and the lowest tier Orc rabble units. The state of their equipment shows most clearly when contrasted with a faction like Gondor, whose lowest spears, the Gondorian spear militia, are relatively well armoured with mail, or with the Rohirrim mustard spears, who at least have helmets and leather cuirasses, unlike these desert spears who have nothing. Due to their lack of armour and poor shields, these guys suffer in melee, especially against shock troops but also against archers, who can destroy units of them with ease. Even shock cavalry can tear them apart, although when swarming shock cavalry they can be quite good at killing them. While they aren't a great unit, they're just there to absorb damage and hold off the enemy, while your other units dismantle enemy armies, and that's one thing they can do, if not that well. I advise replacing them as quickly as possible, as while they can hold their own against starting units to a degree, even mid-tier units can fairly easily wreck them. Overall, a unit which is the building block of a Haradrim army, but one which shouldn't be relied upon as the faction does have better spears, one of those units being the Mahud Beast Tamers. Considerably more well armoured than the Desert Spears, even if they don't have helmets, the Mahud Beast Tamers rely on wicker cuirasses decorated with teeth and claws, probably from animals they've hunted. The decoration of warriors with trophies taken in hunting was quite widespread across the globe, with many tribes partaking in it, so it makes sense to see it here. Completing their armour setup are long leather vambraces protecting their arms, which are far more historically accurate than the leather cuffs you see characters in historical settings often wear, such cuffs not existing. For weapons, they have spears which appear to have tips suited for both slashing and stabbing, with cross pieces meant to prevent enemies or animals sliding down the shaft, which makes sense, given these are warriors who primarily fight the animals of Harad. For shields, they use large wooden ones covered in rawhide, reminiscent of both Zulu shields and Celtic shields. Completing their look, they have the fearsome-looking face paint as well as frameworks on their back. Their officer is equipped identically to his men, bearing a spear and a shield, while having the same skull face paint as the previous Mahud unit officer. An interesting thing to note is that the banner for the unit is a stylized Mumakil, showing off the unit's origin from the wild jungles of Far Harad with all its amazing creatures. As a unit, these guys are far more effective spearmen than the Desert Spears, actually being able to form up a shield wall instead of being a rabble of desert nomads. With their larger shields and armour, they're able to withstand melee, capable of defeating militia troops and holding their own against medium infantry, although shock infantry and heavy melee infantry can beat them. Against archers they do far better than the previous unit, although because they lack extensive armour, they don't do as well as some other units when trying to absorb enemy fire. Against the cavalry the unit does well, capable of holding the line against cavalry and killing them. As much of a step up over the Desert Spears as this unit is, it can't easily replace them due to there being a limit on how many of this unit an army can field. That said, I recommend replacing as many Desert Spears as possible with this unit, as while the unit does get overshadowed by other spear units, it's still useful later on in the game as a support unit, and the less Desert Spears you have to rely on, the better. Moving on from the Mahud Beast Tamers, we come to the last of the Haradrim spear units, the Serpent Spearmen. This unit of heavy spearmen is equipped identically to the Serpent Warriors, so we'll skip their armour and move to their weapons and shields. They use a variety of spears, all of them being the same kind as those used by the Desert Spears, so we've already discussed these weapons before. For shields, they have oval shields identical to those used by the officer of the Serpent Warriors, some of them having a central metal boss while others don't. The shields are very much resembling those used by sub-Saharan African tribes. Their officer is the exact same as the officer of the Serpent Warriors, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit role. These are the heaviest spearmen that the Haradrim have access to, and are a core part of your mid to high tier armies, being the majority of your melee infantry. They're very good at holding the line and are a match for the heavy spears fielded by other factions, with their armour and shields making for soldiers who do very well in melee and who are capable of absorbing the fire of enemy ranged units quite easily. Not just great at holding the line, these guys excel at killing cavalry, being a major threat to enemy horsemen. That said, for all their combat prowess, shock troops can defeat the unit, and cavalry charges to the rear will be very effective, just as they are against any other unit. The best thing by far about this unit is that it combines good quality with the ability to be recruited as much as possible, making it a clear standout from much of the rest of the Haradrim roster, meaning this unit can quickly become the bulk of an army. I recommend replacing your Desert Spears as quickly as possible with this unit, and then phasing out any Mahud Beast Tamers at your own pace, given both units work well in tandem. Strategy-wise, the unit should be used to pin down enemy infantry and to ward off cavalry, while the faction's extensive ranged units, both mounted and dismounted, take apart enemy units shot by shot. A very cool unit and one that is a must-have for any Haradrim army. With this unit covered, all of the melee infantry the Haradrim have access to have been looked at, so we'll move on to their ranged units, starting with the Desert Bowmen. Equipped just as poorly as the Desert Spears, these archers are very clearly levied troops, such men often being a common sight in armies operating in the Middle East in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, Wearing no armor and lacking shields, the only equipment they have are recurve bows and a range of swords identical to those used by the Haradrim swords. The recurve bows look very accurate and make sense, given they were very prolific in the Middle East after being introduced there by the steppe peoples who pioneered them. While recurve bows were more commonly associated with mounted archers, infantry used them quite a lot, with the bows used by the men in this unit doubling as hunting weapons most likely. The unit officer is a Haradrim swordsman lacking a wicker cuirass, only having a wicker gorget, making him that much more poorly equipped compared to the standard Haradrim swordsman. As a unit, these guys are a crucial, if incredibly bad, part of early army builds for the Haradrim, giving their armies the first taste of the ranged power the faction can bring to bear against enemies. While worse archers than most low-level archers they'll face, they can defeat low-tier enemy infantry if given enough time, which is where the desert spears come into the equation. That said, while they do give you ranged support, phasing them out as quickly as possible is a priority. The next archer unit available in the roster are the Corsair Archers, the ranged equivalent of the Corsair Marines. Wearing the same dark clothing as the Corsair Marines, and having the same ahistorical studded leather armor, they have the same recurve bows as the Desert Bowmen, which makes sense given the cultural and military exchanges between the Corsairs of Umbar and the Haradrim dwelling in the desert. For melee, they use daggers and the same cut-down boarding harpoons. For an officer, they have a Corsair equipped almost identically to them, dual-wielding 2 daggers. As a unit, the Corsair Archers are a step up from the Desert Bowmen, although they're only really an improvement in terms of skill with the bow, being better archers while being just as lousy in melee. Because they are somewhat more skilled archers, although other bowmen in the game far outclass them, these guys are useful for supplementing Desert Bowmen, given only a limited amount can be in an army, meaning they can't fully replace the previous unit. Instead, they should be used to partially replace the Desert Bowmen until you gain access to better archers that have no limit on their usage, making sure to avoid throwing these guys into melee given they're quite woeful at it. Moving on, we now come to the next archer unit, the Haradrim Archers. Equipped just like the Haradrim swordsmen and glaives, they instead use what can only be described as short bows with spikes on the bow shaft. While the spikes are weird, short bows being used by the disparate Haradrim tribesmen makes sense, given short bows were a common sight among tribal populations of the Middle East, the people who these particular Haradrim are based off of. For melee, they use the same collection of blades as the Desert Bowmen, while their officer is identical to the one leading the Haradrim swordsmen. As a unit, these are the standard archers that will make up the core of your army for most of the game, and will be crucial in thinning enemy lines with their arrows, helping to materialize a victory. While they are very useful and a step up from the Desert Bowmen and equivalent with the Corsair Archers in terms of quality, their greatest strength is that because they have no limit on their recruitment, they can be used en masse to destroy enemy units in a way that the faction couldn't do before unlocking them. That said, they do poorly in melee, only being mediocre as flanking infantry, while against shock troops, shock cavalry, or elite bowmen, they barely stand a chance. Overall, a key component of any Haradrim army, although they are outperformed by several other archer units they're likely to encounter. Luckily for the Haradrim, they have a unit that can answer those threats in the form of the Serpent Archers. These well-armoured archers are equipped the same as the Serpent Warriors and the Serpent Spearmen, so we'll skip their armour and move on to their weapons, which are the exact same as the Haradrim Archers, for both their bows and their swords, skipping their officer, who's a standard Serpent officer shared by the other Serpent units. We'll get into their unit role. As archers, these are the best that the Haradrim faction can field in large numbers, outclassing the Haradrim Archers and being a clear replacement for them. Better archers than the previous unit due to being professional soldiers rather than tribal warriors, the Serpent Archers can go toe-to-toe with most good archer units, like Gondorian Archers, although against elite Elven Archers they may run into difficulties. When pressed into melee, this unit doesn't do so bad, being adequate at flanking the enemy or attacking them from the rear, even being able of fighting low-tier militia head-to-head, although shock cavalry and infantry are a death sentence. This unit takes the core strategy of the Haradrim and enhances it, giving the Haradrim access to greater firepower, making victory that much more certain. While I said these were the best archers the faction can field, I said specifically in large numbers, as the faction does have another archer unit that outperforms it in quality, the Black Serpent Rangers. This unit of elite archers is very lightly equipped, wearing black robes, hoods, and masks for stealth, while the only visible bit of armor they have are their segmented van braces. For weapons, they're equipped the same as the serpent archers, while their officer, who doubles as the unit's standard bearer, wears the same robes as them, underneath a shirt of gilded mail, beneath a gilded plate cuirass, finishing off his look with a leopard skin cloak and a sword. As a unit, these guys are equivalent, if not superior, to the ranger units fielded by other factions, such as the Ithilien Rangers of Gondor or the Rangers of Dale, given that this unit can be a general for the Haradrim unlike the other rangers. In terms of combat capability, the men of the unit are great archers, able to deploy with stealth, allowing them to ambush enemy armies like the other ranger units. In melee, these guys do very well despite their lack of armor, being trained enough to the point that they can fight on the front lines against good quality melee troops and win, although against shock infantry and cavalry they fare poorly. While they are very skilled archers, due to their lack of armor, they can't absorb enemy volleys well, meaning that they can lose in archery duels against lesser troops who have the ability to absorb more damage than them. While these guys are by far the most elite archers that the Haradrim can field, because they're so elite, there's a limit on how many you can bring to the battlefield, meaning they'll never be able to comprise your entire archer force, and are best used to support your serpent archers, giving you a large and high quality archer force. As a general unit, I consider them lackluster apart from when playing as a defender in sieges, given that on the open battlefield they'll be vulnerable to enemy ranged units as well as cavalry and shock infantry, and don't really have the strength needed to capitalize on potential opportunities the way the other generals of the Haradrim can. Overall, a very unique unit that makes clear the fact that the Haradrim are very much a faction oriented towards ranged combat rather than melee, and which gives the Haradrim ambush capabilities, which is always nice to have, being an evil mirror of the Rangers of the Men of the West after all. While the Black Serpent Rangers are the last of the Haradrim roster archers, the faction still has more ranged units, having the Mahud Hunters, a group of light skirmishers. Dressed and equipped identically to the Mahud Clubmen, some of them wearing leopard skins and others going without, while all having shields. The main thing that differentiates this unit from the Clubmen are their weapons, having a club as a backup in case of melee, but primarily using veined javelins. Javelins were the primary weapon of many tribal cultures throughout the world, such as the Zulu originally, before they transitioned to thrusting spears, so it makes sense that the Mahud would utilize javelins, given they're useful for killing enemies in low-intensity conflicts and for hunting game. The javelins look like plumata, a javelin used by the late Roman Empire which replaced their earlier pila javelins, due to the veins added to the javelin. The unit officer is yet another Mahud officer with the grim skull face paint wielding a club as his weapon. As a unit, these guys are at best supplementary, being able to release a couple volleys of javelins before closing with the enemy in melee, something they do somewhat well at. Because they have large shields, they can somewhat endure enemy ranged fire, although their lack of body armor still makes them a less durable unit compared to others. The unit does have several distinct weaknesses though that make it a unit that can be dispensed with when playing as the Haradrim, given that as skirmishers, they inherently have far shorter range than bowmen, meaning they can be destroyed by enemy archers before they can actually be put to use, while because they're a tribal unit, only a few can be in an army, meaning they'll never be the heart of your ranged power. Against melee troops above militia level or shock infantry and cavalry, they stand no chance. However, the thing that really makes them superfluous is that the Haradrim have access to so many archer units that outperform this unit, except for in melee, that it's unneeded, only really being useful in low-tier armies as a way of beefing up both your ranged and melee infantry, which will most likely be comprised of desert spears and desert bowmen, this unit doubling as a skirmisher and as melee infantry. While the unit is generally only really useful in the early stages of the game and quickly becomes obsolete, the Mahud Hunters are nevertheless a pretty cool unit in appearance that puts in some service at the very least. Moving on from the infantry of the Haradrim, be they melee or ranged, we come to their cavalry, starting with the faction's only melee cavalry, the Camel Riders. As a unit, these are pretty much Haradrim swordsmen mounted atop unarmoured camels, becoming camelry rather than cavalry, using the same armor, shields and swords as their infantry counterparts, their officer being the same as the infantry one. Using camels as mounts is something that was and still is done very commonly, especially in desert regions for multiple reasons, Camels not only being used in the Middle East for millennia, but also by the United States for a limited time during the 1800s. Because camels by nature live in arid environments, they can survive the heat far more easily than horses and can go for far longer without water, an invaluable factor when operating in the desert. Horses are also naturally scared of the smell of camels, meaning that in clashes between riders on the two in real life, the horses would often attempt to flee unless being trained specifically to stand their ground. Last of all, camels are physically bigger than horses, with their riders being positioned higher above the ground, and if we know one thing, it's that you want the high ground in battle. As a mounted unit, these guys do well at pinning down low to mid-tier shock cavalry and preventing them from fleeing, while also being capable of charging enemy formations, although not capable of causing as much damage as shock cavalry, also being good at defending flanks against enemy cavalry. Because the unit is fairly unarmoured all things considered, it is very weak to spears and pikes like all mounted units, and archers can be somewhat of a problem. Overall a unique unit, being the only camel unit in the mod so far, and one that helps round out the cavalry available to the Haradrim, which tends to be light to medium cavalry more so than the heavy horse fielded by other factions like Rohan. We'll move on from the melee cavalry and turn to the first shock cavalry unit that the faction can field, the Haradrim Lancers. This unit of shock cavalry is essentially a fusion of the Haradrim swordsmen in terms of armour and the Serpent Guards cavalry unit, having the same lance as them and the same limited armour for the horses, with the officer being another standard Haradrim officer. Because this unit is much of what we've seen before, we'll move on to its role on the battlefield. As shock cavalry, these will be the core of your striking power, with your camels tying up enemy cavalry, while these guys cycle charge into the enemy until they break. As shock cavalry, they can deliver a lot of damage, although because they're so lightly equipped, they do very poorly against ranged units, with their horses just being big targets. Against spears and pikes, they do abysmally, as well as against shock troops and melee cavalry when stuck in battle, making careful micromanagement of the unit a must. In charges at enemy shock cavalry, they only really fare decently against militia-level shock cavalry, as against more medium and elite shock cavalry, they stand no chance. Unfortunately for the Haradrim, this is their best shock cavalry unit that they can field in large numbers, due to the next shock cavalry unit in the roster being the Serpent Guards unit, which we already looked at as both a regular unit and as a general, meaning that while the Haradrim do have shock capabilities, they're outmatched by other civilization shock cavalry. A cool unit overall which gives the faction hard-hitting power, but generally a bit underpowered compared to its peers. With the Haradrim Lancers looked at and the Serpent Guards covered near the beginning of the video, we'll move on to the faction's ranged cavalry, beginning with the Haradrim Horse Archers. Equipped exactly the same as the Haradrim Archers in terms of riders, and their horses being identical to those of the other cavalry units, the main thing that sets these men apart from the other mounted units are their recurve bows, the same as those used by the desert bowmen. For mounted archers, these are the perfect weapon given they're compact enough to be used on horseback or packing a lot of power and range, unlike longbows, which were used by men on horseback. However, those men would have to dismount to use their weapons. Recurve bows such as this being used heavily by the steppe peoples such as the Mongols because you don't need to dismount to use it. Skipping their officer, who's the same as the previous mounted unit officers, the Haradrim Horse Archers are a core component of your armies, circling enemy units and picking off soldiers with their arrows, until the units are too weak to face off against the Haradrim line infantry, or until shock cavalry are deployed to run down the enemy, essentially copying the strategies used by steppe cultures and desert nomads to great success for centuries. These hidden run strategies are what this unit excels at, being fast enough to outpace enemy infantry and cavalry due to being so lightly equipped. Because the unit has no limit on how many can be fielded in an army, unlike the other factions in the game, such as the Rohirrim and their limited force of cavalry archers, this unit can be used in large numbers to devastating effect, even being useful at charging enemy lines from the rear once they've engaged your infantry, although they're obviously far less effective than shock or even melee cavalry in doing so. However, the unit does have some distinct weaknesses that limit how it can be used, such as its lack of armour for rider and horse, meaning that when engaged in melee against spears, pikes or polearms, the unit has absolutely no chance, while fighting against melee or shock cavalry is a bad idea. Lastly, because they are mounted archers, they have shorter range than archers on foot, meaning the enemy can counter this unit with return fire, something the unit can't absorb due to its woeful armour. This means that unless you're planning on raining death on the enemy by outflanking them and shooting into their rear, it's necessary to first clear the way of enemy archers with your own before fully deploying this unit. Because this unit is the only horse archer unit the faction has access to, it's going to be a staple in Haradrim armies going all the way into elite tier armies. Overall, one of the most important units in the Haradrim roster that when working alongside certain other units can hand victory on a platter to prospective Haradrim generals. Moving on from the Haradrim horse archers, we'll leave behind mounted archers and arrive at skirmisher cavalry with the Desert Raiders. Equipped completely the same as the Desert Bowmen, which is to say lacking equipment entirely, these troops are the least armoured cavalry that the Haradrim can field, having no armour except for the small amount of wicker used to protect their horses, and their only weapons being veined javelins. Javelins being used on horseback is an ancient concept, and a widespread one at that, the Gallic tribes of Western Europe and the Hispanic tribes such as the Cantabri being famous for using mounted skirmishers to wear down enemy infantry, Spain funnily enough continuing the tradition of having great mounted skirmishers into the Middle Ages, where light Arabic horsemen known as jinetes, who wielded javelins, were quite widespread. Arguably the most famous mounted skirmishers of all time were the Numidians from North Africa, who were known to have among the best light cavalry in antiquity. Skipping their officer, who's a mounted desert archer officer, will get into the unit's role. Operating as they do, this unit will be a core component of early Haradrim army builds, providing your armies with mounted range support they would otherwise lack, until access to the Haradrim horse archers is gained. Because of this, they are very useful, however that usefulness quickly diminishes the longer games go, as they're quickly outpaced by other units in the Haradrim roster, as well as by enemy units, making them obsolete pretty quick. While the unit shares the same weaknesses as the previous unit, only magnified because of their complete lack of armour, it also has the weakness shared by all skirmisher units, a lack of range compared to equivalent archer units. What this means is that when facing off against archers, the unit is far more likely to suffer high casualties before engaging the enemy, potentially even breaking due to their lowly status and lack of morale and training. While this unit does have greater hitting power due to using a javelin rather than an arrow, this means that against mounted archers it's at a disadvantage, while against archers on foot it is greatly outmatched, which is where your first crop of archers become useful in driving away enemy bowmen before deploying the Desert Raiders. Overall, a vital part of early Haradrim armies, but a unit that should be replaced as quickly as possible by other mounted units. With the Desert Raiders covered, we can now move on to the most unique unit the Haradrim can field, the Baby Mumakil. The reason for this unit being so unique is of course because it's the only elephant unit in the mod currently. Before I get into the details of the unit, I want to note that this is a placeholder unit as the modders are currently working on creating a Mumakil model that accurately represents the animal's size, so for now we have this unit which nonetheless is very cool. The Mumakil, gigantic oversized elephant relatives, are one of the main strengths of the Haradrim tribes, being massive beasts of war that are captured in the wild jungles to the far south in Far Harad. One thing to note about Mumakil that sets them apart from elephants, apart from their colossal size when fully grown, are their tusks, having 3 sets of them including their smaller vestigial tusks. These babies, the size of full-grown elephants, have a crew of 2 stationed in a howdah on their backs, howdahs being the carriage carried on the back of elephants in real life, both for civilian purposes and as a position from which to wage war, often having archers on the elephant's back ready to use its height advantage to target enemies. The men riding the Baby Mumakil of the Mahud tribes, one wearing a leopard skin operating as a Mahut, that is to say a driver of elephants, while the other is an unarmoured archer using a short bow. These 2 men are able to guide the Baby Mumakil directly into enemy formations, while also shooting at the enemy from above. The Mumakil are unarmoured apart from the fabric upon which the howdah rests, their tough hide being more than effective armour, especially for the adults. The commanding officer of the unit is just a Mahud hunter's officer, having the standard shield, club and skull face paint, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit's role. As essentially war elephants, these guys excel at smashing into enemy formations and breaching them, causing as much damage to enemy lines as possible with added lethality from each Mumakil's archer. War elephants are an ancient idea being used originally by Indians in antiquity, before the practice spread throughout the ancient world, famously being used by the Carthaginians in the ancient Indian kingdoms, but continuing to see use through the Middle Ages and all the way into the 1800s, some elephants being used as part of military operations in the past century, although as beasts of burden rather than as war elephants, historical war elephants often being heavily armoured. While the baby Mumakil can shred enemy infantry formations if they're caught out of position, or can crush enemy cavalry in head-on charges, the unit is still vulnerable to some counters. As thick as their hides are, volleys of archer fire can bring them down, with skirmishers especially being very effective at killing war elephants in real life and in the mod. Spearmen and pikemen are also quite lethal against the baby Mumakil, although their formations are likely to be disrupted when doing so, with shock troops and polearm soldiers being useful at bringing them down once they're stuck deep in enemy formations, their large weapons being great at piercing their hides. Taken together, what this means is that the Haradrim have a veritable tank in their roster, capable of destroying enemy formations and allowing your forces to roll back the enemy, while when kept in reserve they can entirely change the course of battles, especially when the enemy doesn't expect them to be there. Like tanks, it has weaknesses, but as a general it's your job to mitigate those weaknesses and exploit its many strengths. As amazing as the unit is, because it's so elite, only a limited number can be in an army, meaning that you won't be able to steamroll the enemy with endless stacks of Mumakil, instead being most useful as an ace up your sleeve which can change the course of a battle in an instant, especially when used to the fullest. Before we finish covering this unit, it must be said that it's a potential general unit for the faction, and it's a very interesting one. While it certainly has the strength a general unit needs, it can easily take advantage of holes in the enemy line, and shifts battles in your favour when deployed, being a great reserve force to call upon, I would still consider it inferior to the Serpent Guards. While it is far tougher than that unit and can cause way more damage, its large size and slow speed means that it can very easily be destroyed by enemy ranged units before it can reach its maximum usefulness, unlike the Serpent Guards, which can launch deadly cavalry charges into enemy rears and avoid enemy fire by using their great speed and mobility, something this unit most definitely lacks. Overall, it's a hard-hitting unit that helps differentiate the Haradrim from other factions, and is the coolest unit in the Haradrim roster by a mile, but once the adult forms are added to the mod, there'll be a new king in the unit roster as far as I'm concerned. Moving on from this most unique of units, we come to probably the most common one in the mod, the Onager. Crewed by Haradrim swordsmen lacking shields, this unit provides the Haradrim with siege capabilities, allowing them to destroy enemy fortifications with artillery rather than take them by storm, a strategy the Haradrim aren't exactly suited for, being better on the defensive in sieges where this unit is useful for counterfire rather than being on the offensive. Because they only have onagers, the Haradrim are outclassed when it comes to siege by some other factions such as the Gondorians with their trebuchets, which are far more effective, if expensive, siege engines. With the units of the Haradrim roster covered, let's look at the Haradrim as a whole. As a faction, the Haradrim are well-rounded with a noted disposition towards ranged units and light to medium cavalry, their main strategy being to bleed the enemy of strength with hidden run tactics before destroying the remnants of their armies, or when this fails, using the overwhelming strength of Mumakil to tear enemy armies apart before taking advantage of the chaos with their shock cavalry and infantry. While they lack the infantry strength of the dwarves and Gondorians, don't have the shock cavalry capabilities of the Rohirrim, or the ranged excellence of the elves, the faction has a niche and sticks to it, doing a good job at differentiating itself from the other factions with its preferred playstyle, while also keeping its options open. Definitely a defensive civilization that can pivot to swarming, the Haradrim have been an excellent addition to the mod, and I can't wait to see how their roster will grow in the future. Having covered all the factions currently in the mod, I'm planning on doing videos discussing the changes made to other factions in the mod, as well as making videos on other mods and their factions. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. This is your host Jakov, signing out.